The Las Vegas Raiders have benched Derek Carr. It's been a very, very disappointing season for the Raiders. Las Vegas had a huge offseason where it gave Derek Carr, Hunter Renfrow, and early in the regular season, Darren Waller an extension. The Raiders traded for Davante Adams from the Packers and hired a new head coach, Josh McDaniels. There were very high expectations in Las Vegas, but they weren't met at all. The Raiders disappointed all year and had constant injury issues. The Raiders have lost 2 of their last 3, and their playoff hopes have virtually disappeared. The future is a bit cloudy in Las Vegas. It's likely that Derek Carr isn't the Raiders quarterback next season, and the future for both Davante Adams and Josh McDaniels is uncertain. The Raiders came into this season with high expectations, but fell flat. Everyone was excited to see how the Raiders would perform to start the year, but Las Vegas lost its first 3 games of the year in the most disappointing way. The Raiders lost to the Chargers by 5 in week 1, and week 2 was just embarrassing. Las Vegas led 20-0 at the half over the Cardinals, and Arizona ended up storming back to tie it and eventually won it in overtime. The Raiders then lost by 2 to the Titans in week 3 to drop to 0-3. Finally, Las Vegas got in the win column the next week after beating the Broncos. Week 5 versus the Chiefs is one of those games that's constantly pointed out as a Josh McDaniels failure. The Raiders scored a touchdown with 4:27 remaining to make it 30-29, and McDaniels decided to go for 2 for some reason, and they didn't get it. Las Vegas lost, and he was criticized for the move, and frankly, I agree. I like going for 2 to win the game, especially against a team that's more superior, like the Kansas City Chiefs. But there was almost 5 minutes remaining in the game. That's just a really weird call in my opinion. The Raiders then had a week 6 bye and came out of it and beat the Texans pretty good. That put Las Vegas at 2-4, and you would think they would have gained some momentum, but the Raiders turned around and lost their next 3. Easily the worst performance of the year was a 24-0 loss to the Saints that started that losing streak. Las Vegas followed it up by blowing a 20-7 lead to the Jaguars and losing to the Colts the same week. Indianapolis fired Frank Reich and named Jeff Saturday their interim head coach. The Raiders did rattle off 3 straight wins after the 3-game losing streak though. Back-to-back came in overtime against the Broncos and Seahawks, and then in week 13, the Raiders beat the Chargers. That left the Raiders at 5-7 with 5 games to play and an outside chance to make the postseason. But Las Vegas just continued to underperform. The Raiders played the Rams on Thursday Night Football in week 14 and lost to Baker Mayfield after he had been claimed by Los Angeles on the Tuesday before that game. The Raiders did beat the Patriots the next week in what was probably the worst final play of a game I've ever seen in my entire life, and yes, I'm still not over it. I'm still not sure what Ramondre Stevenson was thinking, and Jacoby Myers made possibly the worst lateral pass in league history that Chandler Jones snagged and ended up scoring. Then in week 16, Las Vegas led Pittsburgh 10-3 at the half and somehow lost 13-10 to drop to 6-9. The Raiders had a lot of big offseason moves, trading for Davante Adams and hiring Josh McDaniels. Las Vegas fired John Gruden during the 2021 season after old emails surfaced. Rich Bisaccia took over as the interim head coach, and there were a lot of people that believed that Bisaccia should remain in charge, but the Raiders instead hired Josh McDaniels. McDaniels had a ton of success as the Patriots offensive coordinator, but he did have one previous head coaching stint, and it went very poorly. He was hired by the Broncos back in 2009, and Denver went 8-8 before struggling in 2010, starting 3-9, leading to McDaniels being fired after less than 2 seasons in Denver. It took over a decade for him to get another chance as a head coach, but it's looking like another failed stint early on. There are already plenty of fans calling for his firing. I wouldn't be shocked if McDaniels were fired by Las Vegas after the season, but I honestly don't think that kind of decision happens until the regular season is all wrapped up. Josh McDaniels is clearly in a very interesting position, but so is Davante Adams. Adams was offered a nice deal to stay in Green Bay, but wanted to reunite with Derek Carr, who he played with at Fresno State. The Raiders traded away a first and second for Adams and ended up signing him to a 5-year, $141.25 million deal. Everyone knew what Davante Adams was before he came to Las Vegas. He had 3 seasons in Green Bay with over 1,300 yards, including over 1,500 in 2021. Adams recorded double-digit touchdowns in 5 of those seasons, and he was undeniably one of the best wide receivers in football, and he still has been in Las Vegas. In 16 games, Adams has 95 receptions for 1,443 yards and 14 receiving touchdowns, currently the most in the league. He's a Pro Bowler for the 6th consecutive year. I think there's going to be heavy speculation this offseason for a potential Aaron Rodgers trade to Las Vegas. The Raiders would honestly probably love that, but I don't know if Green Bay would bite. I can't help but wonder what if when it comes to the Raiders this season. The trade for Davante Adams was supposed to add a huge spark to the Las Vegas offense, but injuries limited us from seeing its full potential. We really only got to see 5 games of Derek Carr with his top 3 receiving weapons: Davante Adams, Hunter Renfrow, and Darren Waller. Renfrow suffered a concussion in week 2 and ended up missing 2 games. Then, in week 9, he suffered an oblique injury and landed on injured reserve before finally returning in week 15. He's played in 9 games this season with 29 receptions for 248 yards and a touchdown. Darren Waller went down with a hamstring injury in week 5 and ended up spending some time on injured reserve and didn't play again until week 15. He's only played in 8 games with 26 receptions for 353 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Raiders' offense has no doubt ended up being a more run-heavy game than we expected. Josh Jacobs had his 5th-year option declined, and he clearly took that personally. Jacobs has 323 attempts for a league-leading 1,600 yards and 12 touchdowns. Josh McDaniels announced on Wednesday that the Raiders were going to bench Derek Carr. Carr and the Raiders agreed that he would step away from the team for the remainder of the regular season to not be a distraction. He played in 15 games, throwing for 3,522 yards, 24 touchdowns, and 14 interceptions. His benching leaves Jarrett Stidham as the Raiders starter. Vegas traded a 6th and a 7th to New England for Stidham in the offseason. That also means that the Raiders are a Stidham injury away from playing undrafted rookie Chase Garbers. It feels like the final writing on the wall for Derek Carr in Las Vegas. The Raiders gave Carr a 3-year, $121.5 million extension in the offseason, but it was structured in a way where there's no guaranteed money after this season. The Raiders' dead cap is only $5.6 million if Carr is cut. Vegas has to make a decision sooner rather than later, because his $32.9 million base salary and $7.5 million of his 2024 salary becomes fully guaranteed on February 15th. I honestly, like many, had high hopes for the Las Vegas Raiders this season. I mean, on paper, it's hard to argue the pieces aren't there, and frankly, I thought the roster was too good for even Josh McDaniels to screw it up. But maybe we were a little too optimistic. The Chiefs were always going to be the kings in the AFC West, and I thought maybe the Chargers could make a run at the division title too, but I fully expected the Raiders to be right there in the postseason. Las Vegas was a playoff team a season ago with an interim head coach, and they also had a serious chance to defeat the Bengals in the wild card. I really do have a hard time believing that the Raiders didn't get better in the offseason on paper by trading for Davante Adams. Las Vegas did also sign Chandler Jones to a 3-year, $51 million contract, which at the time, many considered him to be the best defensive free agent available, and he's just been incredibly disappointing. Jones has just 4.5 sacks this season and only had a half sack through 11 games. You can blame injuries to a certain degree for the Raiders' lackluster year, but I do think coaching played a huge role. The Raiders lost a lot of close games that went down to the wire, and for one reason or another, Las Vegas lost them. It's clear that the Raiders are a talented team, but there's something missing, and maybe that's Josh McDaniels, or maybe it's Derek Carr. Carr has had a very interesting career. I think there was a long stretch of his career that he was extremely underrated. A lot of people forget just how amazing he was in 2016. Oakland was one of the best teams in the league, and Carr was playing great, but he ended up going down with a fractured fibula, and that derailed the Raiders' season. Carr has had his moments as a very good NFL quarterback, and will definitely get another chance to prove that he is good enough to start. But honestly, I don't think that's going to come in Las Vegas.